And no matter what that effort is, it's going to be more than just care and feeding because, hey, we've got to build something, we've got to maintain something, and then all of our teams have to be able to configure that stuff to use this. So it became more of a, not that this is going to be a huge cost, just that it's going to be a massive pain to do this shit. It's not that it's not worth the money because you can't quantify that exactly, but it's definitely not worth the hassle.
Hey, and welcome to this episode of Build versus Buy, a 30-minute conversation with product and engineering leaders about situations during their career where they've had to decide whether to build or buy. If you'd like to be a guest, reach out to me at Mang-Git@useanvil.com. That's MANGGIT@useanvil.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe on YouTube or leave us a rating/review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Enjoy this episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Build vs. Buy podcast from Anvil. I'm your host, Mang-Git, founder and CEO of Anvil, the fastest way to build software for documents. And today, as my guest, I have Tom Elliot. He is the founder of Ocuroot. It is the easiest way to deploy your code across multiple environments. Thanks for joining me today, Tom.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. To start, we always like to get a quick background of you as an individual and the company that you founded.
Yeah, sure. I've been in the industry for coming up on 20 years now. Make me feel really old to say that, but tried a whole bunch of different things over the years. Like my first quote unquote real job was at VMware doing enterprise server grade stuff, boxed software. They let us keep boxes of everything we'd worked on our desks. That was fun. And went from there, moved from London to New York, started working for a really small consumer VPN company. So doing a bunch of networking stuff, but I was also doing a lot of like user-facing front-end, desktop, mobile, all that kind of stuff. And a couple of years doing that, I then moved to a company called Yext, doing more traditional SaaS type stuff. Joined them as a mobile developer. They then promptly cancelled all the mobile projects, so I moved into backend and went from the massively different, but good to learn different things. Yeah. And I discovered that I really liked building tools and making stuff for people that I worked with, who I was sitting next to. I could see them actually using what I was working on rather than being a few steps removed from a customer. And a few years into my time at Yext, they asked me to lead, was effectively a DevOps group, building all the internal tooling, working with testing infrastructure, CI/CD, all those kinds of things, and just making the overall developer experience better, which I really enjoyed. Had some good challenges through it, got to try out some new technologies, decide whether to build things or buy things a lot of the time. And while I was there, we hit on some challenges mostly around standing up environments for specific purposes. So we had like consumer serving environments that were designed to be points of presence for our read-only APIs, things like that. Make it really fast for our customers in Japan, Europe, the West Coast. Coast-based company, and we wanted to have a European copy of our stack, and that took a whole bunch of time to stand up because you need to go wait for the infra team to set things up, then the database team, then the networking team, and then you've got to know that you're standing everything up in the right order, all those kinds of problems. So it was a really slow process, and I wanted to make that easier. And so what OccuRoot is a way of taking the concepts that you have in continuous integration and continuous deployment or delivery, depending on which D you prefer, and go a level above that and think more about what environments are you deploying to, what releases are you working with, and allowing you to glue together all the automation that you've already got. Say you're working with Terraform or Helm, tools like that. You can just connect them together at the edges. Using Ocuroot, if you've got a very complex system, it can just stand it all up in one go automatically without you having to schedule it.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of sense. Can you maybe take a step back and talk a little bit about your experience at Yext and what the deployment environment was like there, and how did that kind of inform your design decisions when building Ocuroot and the tools you built and how you architected your Ocuroot system?
Yeah, sure. So at Yext, we were using a tool called TeamCity, which has been around for a little while. I think it's from the JetBrains people. And that was basically allowing us to set up a series of deployment pipelines, which they would call a build chain. And we would have the commit phase, which would do all the building. And then that would pass on to some testing, like integration testing after the unit tests were done in the build phase. Then you do a deploy to a dev environment and a staging environment, acceptance tests after the staging environment, and then it would fan out to all the production environments. And we were using Bazel to manage our builds. We didn't have to worry too much about the tool chains we were working with. We were using a lot of Terraform. The infra team used TerraGrunt. We didn't use Kubernetes in production, which was sort of on the short term. When we were a Nomad shop, and so we were running on top of a lot of HashiCorp software. That worked for us because originally we'd had an in-house orchestration system that existed pre-Kubernetes. And only worked with bare processes rather than containers. So Nomad provided kind of an easier jumping off point for us. So we did that migration in 2 phases. But some of the bigger problems that we have is if you add an environment, stick something into the end of your deployment pipeline, you've got to change like the pipelines for 2,500 microservices. And B, if like deployment to one environment fails, what do you do with all the others that might have succeeded? And so what I'm looking to do with OccuRoot is have a state model that is aware of where all these things are, so it can make decisions that make sense. So if one production environment out of 10 fails, you might want to roll that back to a previous good version so everything's in sync. But you might also want to bring in human intervention. You might want to mark the entire build as bad and even revert it in the dev environment. All of those kinds of things. And I want to provide hooks for people to make those decisions at the right time based on what is right for their application.
Got it. Okay. Essentially is mapping out your entire deployment system at a high level and then allowing you to statefully manage what the deployment landscape looks like as you add in new services and also to troubleshoot deployments that have gone awry in order to make sure that the deployments go out properly. Is that high level accurate?
That's pretty good high level. Yeah, I think the key is really the state model. And so there's 2 pieces to that. There's kind of the intent state and the actual state. This is similar to what you might see with Argo, where you deploy your CRDs and then it figures out what to do with them. So this is what I want the world to look like. It does its best to get it into that state. And then you've written logic to handle those changes in state and to deal with failures or with, one thing depending on another. The configuration itself is all in kind of Python-like syntax. So if you have a set of environments and you want to add another one, it's just a loop. So it automatically appears. And if you want to do like a matrix build for different OSs and architectures, again, it's just a couple of for loops. You don't need to learn this like annoying YAML DSL.
Yeah, no, totally. I open up those YAML files and usually it's pattern match to success is how I like to express that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Except for nowadays, Cursor will just suggest something for you. And if you hit tab, 50% of the time, it's right 100% of the time as to what you actually wanted to do.
Yeah, it's pretty good with that thing. I think like the only real challenge that I've had with those kind of things is like understanding what it had written after the fact. Like you still need to know what it's doing there, and that can accelerate you getting to something that works.
Yeah, no, just a side note here. I feel like the biggest unlock with a lot of these AI tooling, developer tooling that I've found for myself is that it allows me to context switch very quickly. But because I have been a developer and I've been a developer for going on 15 years now, I'm able to quickly identify where it messed up, even though it tells you very confidently that it did it correctly. And I think that's the biggest thing is that probably like speed up for more senior developers is that you can very quickly see that the pattern is incorrect or it did something funny here and like, why are you doing that? Make it explain itself. And then it realizes that, oh, wait, it should have done it differently. But if you've never seen the pattern before, you've never experienced the bug before, then it's probably harder for you to see those issues.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I went to a conference earlier this year about testing and someone was talking about property-based tests, which is a concept I'd never heard before. And I was like, I've been using all these AI tools and I've asked them to write tests, but they've never written a property-based test. And I'm like, can it do it? So I go in and like, can you write me property-based tests to verify all of these things? And it like picked a library, wrote all the tests, structured and created all the generators. I'm like, okay, so I need to know what I want it to do
Right.
in order to get it to do it. It's not going to be like creatively suggesting new techniques for me. I've got to have the experience to work with this tool.
Actually, for myself and those who are unaware, what is a property-based test?
Oh, yeah. Like with a typical unit test, you'll write out exactly what you want it to do. This is your input, this is the expected output. A property-based test defines like the tools that I've been using, you'll define a generator that will create valid input and output for your function. And it will just randomly create like 100 of them. So you can test like edge cases. Oh, what if this is the shortest possible string? Or what if this is exceptional null, or that kind of thing. It'll sort of like bake in a lot of those concepts for you.
Got it. Okay. So you explain the situation you want it to test, and then it tests those situations, I guess, based on your expert. It feels almost like prompting to test it in some way.
Kind of, but a little bit more deterministic.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Cool. Thank you for the background on OccuRoot and your experience at Yext that kind of led you to this. I do want to pivot the conversation to what the meat of our podcast is all about, which is build versus buy. And so maybe to start, would love for you to set the stage a little bit. Where were you? What were you doing? And what were like the choices that were presented in front of you in order for this challenge that you were considering build versus buy?
Oh, yeah, sure. I guess the specific story I'd be interested in talking about is a renewal of a tool that we'd already bought when I was working at Yext. And so this was a synthetic monitoring tool called Checkly.
Okay.
I've been using Checkly for a good number of years. Love these guys. They're great. That's not really the point of the tension that we had, though, because what they do is they will schedule requests to like your APIs and your front end at regular intervals. You can define that as either just hit this URL or here's a playwright script that you want to run against this regularly. And we were coming up for our renewal, and we were like a very early customer, so the prices were going up, which is like how it always goes. Totally understandable. So I have a conversation with my boss at the time, and he's like wanting me to basically prove out the value of these additional costs. And the tricky part was, it was basically like, it came down to the only alternative here is to basically write this ourselves and set this running. And
sorry, by this you mean like a system that would regularly check your systems to make sure that the API endpoints are up or the servers are up. And so it's a little bit like a status check, but maybe with a little bit more testing around it than just like a ping. Is that kind of accurate?
It's like a more complicated ping check. Okay, really. It's like I mentioned with the playwright scripts and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so the way that I looked at this was, okay, what would it cost us to just run the infrastructure to do this ourselves? And the question that I was asking myself was like, oh, okay, now how would I implement this if I was to do this myself? And I was like, okay, well, I'd do this in a really boneheaded way. And I'd just have like, a very small server running each of these checks individually. But then like the engineering side of me takes over. I'm like, no, I'd probably actually do this using, maybe I'd do a serverless for these ones, or you could match them together onto a single machine. And the number that I came out with in terms of the cost was a little bit lower than the contract value, but not by much. I'm talking like in the order of hundreds of dollars a year.
And this is to just run the infrastructure. This is not
just to run
building
it and not maintain it.
And I assume the infrastructure would have to be separate from your existing infrastructure, because you can't really test your own infrastructure if you're running on that infrastructure. So you would have to spin up a whole separate system, whether it's serverless functions or your own separate server and maybe a separate cloud hosted system to do this. Is that kind of
which like on the face of it sounds like a big deal, but I guess when you're working with the hyperscalers, that's more or less just like another account or another, what's the word? Like another network, effectively. Put it in a different region. And that would also not have given us a bunch of the features of it. We wouldn't get the UI and all this sort of thing. But that was the point where it got really strange, though, because you can then say, as I think you were alluding to, there's also the cost of actually building the thing, maintaining the thing, having the engineers, and all that kind of thing. And every time I had that conversation around like what the cost of the engineers was, there wasn't a straight line to say, hey, this cost of engineers is comparable to this cost of buying something, because they're coming out of completely separate budgets and you've already paid for the engineers. So there's then another piece to this that you'd have to show to justify the, hey, the engineer's time can be spent on something better.
Yeah.
Because
And
even
I would say it feels almost like the engineer is a sunk cost that you've already paid for. And then you have you're really pricing against the opportunity cost of the engineer not working on something that is customer facing or product specific, or so it's like, how do you price the opportunity cost if the sunk cost is already written off in your head?
Yeah, exactly. Because like then the question becomes, what is the other opportunity? What would you be working on, and what can that deliver for the company? And as we were a team that was all internal stuff, we were entirely a cost center. We're then again once removed from actually bringing in revenue to the company.
Right.
So all of these things add up to make it like really hard to build an ironclad case for a lot of these things. Yeah. Which like became a very interesting place to be, because we had to think of different ways of describing what we were, how we could best be utilized. And a lot of it was trying to effectively tie your upcoming work to higher level company goals. And hey, we can support this company level goal much better if we do this thing. And this is going to take work away from the other teams so they don't have to do quite as much to achieve that goal.
It's fascinating because I feel like in all of the conversations I've had, and even when we pitch Anvil to our customers, which is, hey, we help you build your product faster, Anvil's closer to revenue usually. But I've never had to think about it or pitch it from the perspective of what's the opportunity cost, because the math is generally, how much engineering time is it to build it, and how much engineering time on a regular basis or ongoing basis is it to maintain it, assuming you want to reach some level of, that's not how even feature parity, but 20% feature parity. It's like the base level of things you need. And for you just highlighted that further challenge of being entirely a cost center for the organization. And in some ways, the logical kind of ending to that reasoning is that actually, instead of trying to say, hey, this once removed, my engineering team can provide this much support to your engineers that are doing product and revenue related items, it could be, let's eliminate the cost center and just buy everything. And that's like a lot of times the logical reasoning in operations functions, right? It's like, how do I automate away more and more of the operational support function so that eventually I don't even need to have people, or I have very minimal people on the operational support side, and I only have software or robots or AI agents doing all the work for me on that front. And so I guess it sounds, based on your description, in this scenario, it was the other opposite end, which is we already have all these engineers. How do we make them build more things because we already have them? Was the thought pattern from your senior leaders?
Yeah, it was. So we had the engineers assigned to these kind of things. And to your point about automating away these problems and that kind of thing, we were at a scale where there was definitely things that we needed to be able to do that we couldn't buy. There was no product for this, or there was nothing that could be customized in the way that we could. And we found ourselves very deliberately trying not to grow too quickly and keeping the size of that team down to a very specific percentage of the organization. And the discussions when we were looking to hire other people, it was like, hey, feed the product teams first, because that's where the revenue is going to come from. And so we had a lot of things that we had to maintain. There was a lot of things that we were doing in-house. Some of it was like, it was drastically cheaper to run it in-house. I think the biggest example was observability stuff. Like, it's a decent chunk of work, but like the cost of storing a lot of observability data, there's the classic example of Datadog being, it's very expensive to have a lot of data in there.
Show me your Datadog bill and
yeah, exactly. So we were self-hosting a lot of that using the open source Grafana stack. And we got a pretty efficient system going that was like down to the number of people who had to maintain it theoretically full-time versus the cost of the resource. You can make a very compelling case for doing that. And there was a lot of other little things that we had to do. There were little bits of support, but we were always getting better at that. So because no one likes to do support. So, hey, if we can reduce the amount of effort you got to make there, great. And the biggest thing that I had to do leading that group was to make sure that I always had a clear idea of what all the opportunities were and like what all the different things that we could potentially be doing in the near future were. So when it came down to say, hey, are we going to pay for this product, or are we going to build the equivalent functionality, as you said, like the minimum level that we needed, that I could say, hey, if we do this, we can't do these three things. And I know that you want at least two of these.
Yeah, so I guess maybe to finish out this journey, how did you end up presenting this to your senior executives? How did you position it as the internal champion for Checkly, that this was the right purchase decision, given that you're like right there on the cost from the ongoing server costs, but you needed to figure out how to add in the human cost of this?
Yeah, so it came down to being like, hey, look, it's going to cost us a very similar amount if we just host these capabilities ourselves. We've also got some headroom in what we're doing with them. So like we've got significantly more flexibility in controlling that cost with the way that their model operates. We can make things run less frequently, and that saves us some money. And being able to look at that figure and say, hey, it's about the same. So the difference is all in the effort. And no matter what that effort is, it's going to be more than just care and feeding for the current thing. Because hey, we've got to build something, we've got to maintain something, and then we've got all of our teams have to be able to configure that stuff to use this. So it became more of a, not that this is going to be a huge cost, just that it's going to be a massive pain to do this shit. It's not necessarily that it's not worth the money, because you can't quantify that exactly, but it's definitely not worth the hassle.
Yeah, it feels like, so in some ways you were quantifying the activation energy in order that you needed to overcome in order to come back down at a potentially, not even guaranteed, potentially lower ongoing cost state than just continuing to use Checkly, which is, it is a fascinating kind of decision process where, especially for products that are critical to organizations, you do get this lock-in effect. And that's effectively the flip side of the same thing, which is like, as a company selling your product, you get lock-in, which means that for anybody to switch off of you, you either have to, there's a little bit of leeway for you to, a cushion for you to either capture value, or maybe you really mess up as a company. But not that that's how I think people should think about it, but it really is just, there is that like cushion there where the activation energy is high, and even just the change management post launching a new system is expensive, right? You effectively go from a team that knows how to use something to a team that is completely new to this new system that was home built, probably didn't have that much thought put into developer experience as somebody who was solely dedicated to this at Checkly. That just doesn't, people are bad at quantifying that value, that cost.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this was your experience, but oftentimes I actually see it as quantified on the high end from an internal team. Like you said, the hassle, and then the hassle just brings up so many negative thoughts and so much pain that you think of it as maybe more hassle than it actually is, which benefits the vendor. But I don't know if that's how you felt about it or if that is just me projecting.
No, that's absolutely right. I think the way that I would characterize that is experience and emotional well-being. Like it's, hey, if we have to move over to something in-house that I guarantee you is not going to be as good as this product that like our team loves using and I'm willing to champion, like people have got to change how everything's configured. Like we've got to put in a whole bunch of work to building something. Even if we were to find a product that was like feature parity for half the cost, we'd still going to move over to that. And you've got to go through this whole process. And these things add up. And if you keep like shifting tools underneath people, and if you keep moving from thing to thing, I think a really good example of this is HR software. Like everyone I know has changed HR software so many times, and it's incredibly frustrating. But if you keep making these changes, those little pains add up, and people are less satisfied with their jobs, and you can argue that they perform less effectively as a result, just through low morale.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the interesting things that we have a lot of friends that work at Google, and talking to some of them, they're certainly a build shop, right? They're less of a buy shop. A lot of their internal HR thing triggered this thought. A lot of their HR and like building management software is built in-house. But the nice thing is they're at a scale where when you have 90,000 employees with office locations in pretty much every country in the world, being able to go to an office and badge in with your Google badge that works globally it's a pretty like sleek, miraculous, like awesome experience when you think about it. Just the small friction, the daily frustrations that just gets eliminated because you control all of it. But they're at the scale where it makes sense to build it and they can maintain it over time. Whereas for most organizations, especially if you're not a software company, building the software just sounds like a complete time sink and money sink that doesn't drive revenue.
Yeah. And it's not just size, it's timing as well. Because Google grew up in a period where so many of the concepts that we take for granted now just didn't exist. They had to invent stuff from nothing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like Kubernetes.
Yeah. Right.
Which Google should also roll out a PhD program for all of the Kubernetes people who are trying to implement Kubernetes to take in order to be proficient at Kubernetes.
I would just take week one,
Yeah.
and then like one from there.
Cool. I guess in hindsight, it does feel like you were advocating for this product to continue being the product you use. So it sounds like you were happy with the decision, if I'm correct, right? There probably wasn't. It's pretty obvious that if you really want to continue using this, it sounds like you would have, and you got that was the right decision in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. They're still using it, still happy with it. When I left, actually, the CTO held up Checkly as one of my bigger achievements of bringing that into the company because it did make a huge difference for how we were doing monitoring. And people have enjoyed working with it a lot.
Nice. That's a huge vote of confidence for Checkly for anybody who is listening to us in the kind of like DevOps space. Cool. Maybe just as we're winding down this conversation, we do typically like to ask our guests a couple of fun questions at the end. So to start, I would love to hear about something that you're working on, either professionally or in your personal life, that you're excited about. And it can be anything that you're working on.
Okay. I guess I'd go with the thing that's absolutely top of mind right now, which is something I'm working on for Ocuroot. I'm currently building out a model for referring to basically anything in your state using a URI as a reference so that you can pinpoint a repo, configuration file within that repo, and then all of the deployments and builds and other data that comes out of that using a standard. And there's two reasons I'm really excited about that. One of which it means that users are going to be able to basically have anything depend on anything. So if you've got like a big data structure that you're putting out as an output of one of your deployments and you just want to refer to this one integer midway through it, you can construct a URI that will take you straight there. And you can just depend on that changing. The other side of it is it's making writing the backend so much easier for me because I just have to care about marshalling things into and out of paths. So it's like I've got one function for create, update, read, and delete. And I don't have to write separate things for every different type, which I was doing before. So that's been pretty nice.
Nice. It's funny you said create, read, update, and delete. But so you effectively just redefine CRUD in your application. We can never get away from that paradigm.
You can't, but it's like it's also a really frustrating thing to have to do again and again. And like only having to do that once makes me so happy.
If only all software in the world could be inherited from this root Genesis object that does all of those things for you. Cool. And then last question, it's a fun one. Name something that you've purchased recently that you would either buy again, you love it, or you would never buy again.
That's a really interesting question because I think I'm going to give a weird half and half answer here. Because I've been using Windsurf for probably about since they actually released the Windsurf editor. For those aren't familiar, it's a very similar product to Cursor. It's like a VS Code offshoot and allows you to chat with LLM to write code and all that kind of thing.
Now owned by OpenAI, I believe.
In theory, yeah, it's kind of weird whether that deal closed or not. I don't know. But so I went with them largely because I could understand their privacy model a bit better than Cursor, and they were a little cheaper. And bootstrap solo founder, yeah, I'm saving money wherever I can. Now, I love the concept because now I can have everything in my editor, and because I've got access to an LLM that doesn't just do code, I can write blog posts in there, I can write copy, I had it go through everything that I'd written in my website's blog and condense note on my writing style so that it can like create summaries and drafts and all this kind of thing. And it's a lot closer to how I would write it. So I don't have to edit it quite so much. Always edit after AI generates stuff.
Absolutely. I find it very painful to do that. So actually, if I have a concept already in my head on what I want to write, usually I word vomit it out onto a doc and then I edit, which is less painful to me than having word vomit it into a prompt box that then AI generates and then I have to edit. But yeah, it's not always faster with AI.
My process now tends to be like, I'll write a few bullet points of roughly what I want to say or what I know already, maybe point to another few pages, and then I'll get it to write the first draft, which is terrible. But I have structure and I can go through, I can rewrite it piece by piece. And it's, if nothing else, it gets me over the blank page problem. And it just gets me immediately into a flow.
Do you not find that it's a little bit annoying when AI picks up all of that terrible writing online that people have generated in the past decade or so for SEO reasons? And you ask it to say, hey, write me a blog post about CI and CD pipelines, and it goes, what is a CI/CD pipeline? What does CI stand for? What does CD stand for? And then you have 200 words of just absolute garbage that you need to delete out. Do you not find that the most frustrating thing in the world?
It is annoying, yeah. Like having more context for it, like my writing style and stuff, that does help a bit. The thing that annoys me the most, though, is that it tries to follow like best practices for certain kinds of article, and so the drafts that it generates usually has a bit in the middle that's, I talked to 300 people about this problem and I got all these answers. And I'm like, you're lying. I didn't do that.
But lying confidently, is it really lying? It's just a different truth. Okay, so Windsurfer, you would buy that again, but there was a caveat there.
Yeah, the caveat was that I'm not going to lie, they've had performance issues in the past. Slowdowns, a few outages, those kind of things. Quality went through periods where it was variable. Pretty solid at the moment. I know they're having some possible issues with Anthropic at the moment because of that OpenAI deal. But I was like, I thought I'd shop around, and I had a look at what I would get with Cursor and with Zed. With Cursor, they're pretty comparable. In my experience, they're very similar products. They keep leapfrogging each other. One adds a feature and then the other one adds it. And Zed is a great editor. It's incredibly fast. I think it's not quite there yet with the AI stuff, at least for my personal preferences. Some of the key combinations are a little bit awkward on occasion. I'm sticking with Windsurf for the time being, but I'm keeping my options open because the space is moving so fast that I just want to be aware of what's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like every engineer that I know, or every person that's like kind of keeping up to date with AI tools, is simultaneously using multiple tools in every category and just jumping back and forth between them. There doesn't seem to be any kind of loyalty to one tool at this moment. Somebody who uses ChatGPT is also using Claude. Somebody who's using Cursor is also using Windsurf, or maybe some VS Code plugin that they found online. The nice thing I found about Cursor is actually you can plug in different models, which has been pretty cool. And for a brief period of time, my friends were telling me, oh, the Gemini model is actually pretty good at reading through a lot of these bugs that, that were hard for the Anthropic models to do. And yeah, it's kind of nice to just kind of flip a switch and try out different ones.
Yeah, and comparing them is interesting. I was saying for a while, the Claude models were much better at actually taking action than the ChatGPT models, because the ChatGPT models would ask for permission before doing anything. I don't know whether that was like just the prompts that Windsurf were using, but that was happening to me all the time. But Zed also allows you to plug in your own API keys. You can even use Olama to run models locally. And so I fired up DeepSeek with a low number of parameters recently, and it was so slow. I was like watching it thinking, which was hilarious because it was like, oh, no, wait, that's wrong. No, wait. It just kept correcting itself.
That sounds like a perfect premise for a sketch comedy like skit, where it's like what AI is really thinking is slowed down so that we humans can follow along, and all the branches is trying to go through at the same time.
Well, I thought it was great. If they can learn imposter syndrome, we've got to be closer to AGI.
Awesome. Tom, it was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for taking the time to talk a little bit about OccuRoot, about your experience at Yext with Keckley, and how you convinced your superiors that this was the right decision. I feel like we often come at it with, there is a decision to be made, and this is a new angle that we've now tackled, where you had the decision made, and the decision was whether to continue on. So thank you for bringing that new perspective, and I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Likewise, thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening. If you found this show valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or here on YouTube. We'd love if you could leave us a rating and/or a review, as that helps others find this podcast. See you next time.